Thank you, Deborah, for that very generous introduction. And good morning, all. Thank you also, Deborah and everyone at Freya Sackler for this fantastic exhibition, the catalog, and the symposium. So our first panel today starts off with yoga in place. Place, whether a natural setting or a built environment, plays a key role in facilitating and negotiating practitioners' practice, as well as an individual's relationship, which is mediated sometimes through space and imagery. And the papers in this panel explore these relationships. So I'd invite our first speaker, Professor Michael Meister, W. Norman Brown Professor of South Asia Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, who is well known in this room to many, with an extensive history of publication and a very extensive mentoring role to several in this room alone. The paper is titled Yoga as Architecture, and I turn over to Professor Meister.
I'd like to start by saying that I dreamed last night about Brij Goswami's 5 pilgrims wandering like ants over the surface of the world. And I thank him for that lecture. And I also was asked this morning about questions for our discussion if we have time today. And the 2 that I woke up and wrote down had to do with the cosmetized body and the corporality of the universe. So hold that in your mind and see whether I answer any of it or raise questions about it. I started the proposal for this talk saying or writing that the body and body discipline have marked sacred images in India from an early period. Breath and body are pulse and dimension of the material universe. Cosmogonic speculations in South Asia map the world as body, and on these sites build altars for sacrificial exchange and temples to shelter divinities. I'm told Nancy Micklewright read that and said, "What's he talking about?" I went on, yoga begins with a point with breath, with what Dora Srinivasan identifies in the Vedas as a pregnant masculinity, not embodied, but a pregnant potentiality. Let me see if I can get the script working. Okay. Ishvara, or deity, is the source. Yogins become the foil. Their actions, the discipline, scaffolding, the architecture. Yoga acts today as a physical and mental exercise, multiply defined and multiply patronized. The East, India, acts as source and inspiration, if not, I'm afraid, as sufficient restraint and discipline. This photograph was published in the New York Times in color. I saw it months ago and said, I have to use it. I do think it's a Buddha behind, but maybe not. In India, Ishana, or deity, provides the foil, leading and focusing yogins. Divinity, he or she, is the energy and stillness, the source and active form of the universe. I'm showing you here a temple I've written about and published in an article on the temple as the ocean of story. So I bring everything back to the temple, as many of my students know. It's an extraordinary temple with the whole narrative of female yoga on it. And I think it's important. I send those of you who are interested in the feminine and yoga to that article to see what this temple reveals, what it tells us as a text of its period. Becoming can be imagined as a woman with the lotus in place of her head, her feet rooted, belly full, her body an expression of the waters of cosmic creation, a remnant of an earlier cosmology. And this is a large sculpture that lies on its back in the sanctum of a shrine at Alampur in the Deccan. It is an image that has been identified by Carol Bolin as Lajja Gauri, a particular version of a goddess. And it is clear to her and to me that the way in which she is rooted in the ground and presented ties her in as a goddess of essentially of fertility and of the formation, if you want, of the world. She was discovered, actually, there are several of these shrines in the Deccan, which were actually set up and used for women to come and worship for the sake of becoming pregnant, for becoming fertile and giving birth to sons. Here is another version of Lajja Gauri that is carved at the head or the entrance of a rock-cut stepwell, a very deeply steep stepwell cut into living rock in the western side of India, in Saurashtra, here presented as an embodiment of the earth's fertility. And I expressly want you to make a connection between the goddess herself with her birthing posture, with her knees up and presenting, the lotus in the sense of sprouting and growing, with, in fact, this deep cut into the earth that goes down and down and down until you touch the universal waters of Indian cosmology. The yogin, the practitioner of yoga, focuses on a point, on a tone, on a thought, on a deity. I know of no sculpted image appropriate to give you as an example of that pregnant male of the Vedas, that space-filling form of the potential universe. The closest that I might suggest from a Buddhist cave of the 1st century BC, the Buddhist monastic cave of the 1st century BC, is a figure embodying a pregnant embodying the pregnant clouds of the monsoon. At least that's the way it's always been interpreted, this great full-bodied flying figure as the pregnant clouds. The same pregnant clouds are interpreted as elephants in temple architecture and act as the base and hold the mountain of the temple up in the air on the backs of elephants. So the closest I might suggest is a figure embodying the pregnant clouds of the monsoon. His feet, please notice, turned backward like the female figure I just showed you. And on his back is the chariot of the sun god riding across the sky. So the clouds, this pregnant figure, gives, in a sense, a source for the sun itself. And the sun stands on a wall of this monastic cell for probably an abbot of the cave, stands opposite an image of Indra, the king of heaven, riding on his elephant, who is shaking a tree, has uprooted a tree like a great tornado in our Midwest. Indra rides on this elephant, a tree uprooted in his trunk, above an inhabited landscape, all this fine detail that's under this hovering elephant. A landscape of sacred groves with hunting lions, demons, nature sprites, all manner of beings. The fertile landscape spreads out at his feet. Now, I've put next to this detail the Indus Valley intaglio seals that we saw briefly yesterday. These date from the 2nd millennium BC. And they do suggest, I think, such a richly varied world. With, however, if you look carefully at the few examples, with tree sprites, female figures seemingly in trees, shamans with headdresses, and I use the word shaman on purpose, and seemingly disciplined asana-like postures. All of this, I think, we have to consider in terms of body discipline, but we cannot claim origins for yogic discipline, specifically in so ancient a civilization. We only should keep it as a suggestion of the importance of such body discipline around the world. I would rather, as an architectural historian at least, to turn to another tradition, a diagram of construction of great antiquity in India and of multiple applications over time, something called the vastu purusha mandala, the diagram of the spirit of the place. A marker of the first sacrifice in Indian thinking, its body a flayed demon who lies face down and feet turned back, who, when face up, is transformed by sacrifice and becomes the protector of the site, of the building, of the temple, of this museum. Such a measured diagram was used to determine altars in one part of India's past, to plan cities, palaces, to found temples, and is still used, as in this diagram, to tell horoscopes today, to order the world, to give structure or to reveal structure to the world. Over time, it incorporated Vedic sacrificial, astrological, even Roman sources, defining and ordering the indexical something of the world, sorry. This has enlarged the text just a little bit more than I can read. Okay, I'll skip that sentence. Such proportioning diagrams were redefined to build stone temples in the first millenniums of the Christian era, or the Common Era. At this famous site of Deoghar in the early part of the 6th century, 3 cardinal reliefs define the world's ascent. And this is my interpretation of this famous temple. Good. Vishnu saving an earthly king from the watery coils of a serpent, greeting an ascetic in the liminal zone of the Himalayas, and reclining on the cosmic ocean at the moment he awakes to mark creation's cyclic reconstruction. Notice the way in which the sanctum expands into a platform, expands into corner temples and 4 cardinal entries, and then out into the world. This is the first full flowering of a growth of the temple that you will see over the next millennium. From his navel, a lotus grows as seat for Brahma. Brahma sits on the lotus, his 4 faces marking the directions of that creation. The temple itself perhaps embodying the expanding and multiform world. The mountains behind Bridges' temple in his first and last slide. At Elephanta, a famous site you must all visit or have visited, Shiva is the great lord Mahadeva, means great lord, emerging from the living rock, as art historians like to call it. His face is turned to and creating the cardinal directions. His body is the mountain itself, the hill of Elephanta Island, which is approached by devotees from the north. Within his cavern, the east-west axis forms a temple, focusing on a recognizable sanctum for Shiva's preeminent unembodied sign, a linga. But Shiva Yogeshvara, Shiva as the master of yoga, marks the northern entrance, where pilgrims first arrive. The great image of Mahadeva coming into being is Shiva's first emanation and sits to the right of the sanctum's linga. Yogeshvara Shiva is seated in stillness on a lotus column. Please notice the column, realize what he's sitting on is the head of the column, which is a giant lotus. And his body extends the skamba, the creation column, in this imagery. His whole body is an extension of that column of creation. Announcing his presence, seated in stillness on the lotus column, and this image announces his presence and calls Mahadeva into being. So that as Shiva is emerging in this temple, is being brought into the world to visibly define creation, it is Yogeshvara Shiva, Shiva as master of yoga, who makes that happen, is the magician, in my view, who makes that happen. As yogin, Shiva centers and is the emanation of space. Across from him, in this entrance for pilgrimage at this remarkable site, Shiva also appears as cosmic dancer. And I think the pairing of Shiva Yogeshvara and Shiva as cosmic dancer has a very specific meaning. One, Yogeshvara Shiva creates space, and Shiva dancing in his slow, increasing rhythms marks the beginning of time. In Rajasthan, another stepwell, which actually is dated by an inscription to 685, carved deep into a rock once split by a visible earthquake, is flanked by reliefs of Shiva as master of yoga, again, in the left, and dancing, again Shiva dancing among 7 mothers who differentiate the world to the right of the stepwell. I'm trying to give you that sense of how things emerge from the earth. Temples also mark themselves with yogic references, and I have written an article that Pika keeps telling me was what I should have read to you on Shiva and Vishnu as masters of yoga. Here, Vishnu, as a master of yoga, sits in stillness on the back wall of the temple, while his incarnation as Varaha, who saves the earth, sits on the wall to the south. We tend to think of asceticism as self-denial, I wrote, and self-denial is mortification. In India, asceticism is self-fulfillment. The athleticism of the Greek word, meaning exercise, practice, training, has not been lost in the mental and physical discipline of Hindu yoga. So it doesn't all start in India necessarily. At another temple site in Rajasthan, Bundana, Vishnu as yoga master is joined by Durga on one of its central walls. Durga, the emanation of all male deities, the emanation and consolidation of the power of all male deities, and by Ganesh, the elephant-headed son of Shiva, the giver of wealth and head of Shiva's particulates, the pramatas. Another image of yogic asceticism that I love dearly, and it's much abraded and in an old storeroom now, but I did make a drawing, or have a drawing of it made. It shows Parvati, the wife of Shiva, performing penance, performing Panch Agni Tapas, the penance of five fires. She's surrounded by 4 flames that you can see in the drawing. The 5th flame is her body itself. An image that I assisted in excavating in Pakistan, in the Indus Valley region, at a place called Kafirkot, represents, in my view, a transubstantiating ascetic, holding a scepter, spewing an aureole of seeds, his toes turned down to root him in his lotus base. Now, this was actually first published by a colleague of mine in Pakistan who said it has 3 faces, it's just Shiva. You can read my long discussion about why I think it is not just Shiva. Chakra points, the actual markings that you can see in some of the objects in the exhibition in the gallery, the chakra points of yogic meditation measure his body up to a crowning linga, a sign. Linga means first and foremost sign before it means Shiva's sign of his phallus. measure his body up to a crowning linga hidden behind his head. You can see it in the right-hand drawing that's looking down, the circle, the half circle that sits behind his central head. And I quote at the bottom Mircea Eliade, who wrote that as a result of yogic experience, the physical body becomes dilated, cosmicized, transubstantiated. Divination of man remains a predominant motif of Indian spirituality. That's really the essence of my interpretation of this image. This is a goal, of course, in ancient India, as in the Parvati performing tapasya image I just showed you, and also among artists today. So I had to put in a modern expression, I think, of these same kinds of urges and desires. This transubstantiation is also the goal of temples in their long evolving history, and much more complicated than I'll try to explain to you today. But I wanted to show you the way that something like the simple original form of the temple that emerges at Deoghar in the 6th century has this kind of expression in the 9th century, and it evolves into more complex forms in the high medieval period. So I want you to see the forms emerging, the way the seeds emerge from the Jambu Dwaja, the scepter which this image from Pakistan, from Kofferkot, is holding. The Jambukeshwara temple in Tamil Nadu, this is another favorite of mine, was founded to honor a sage who swallowed the seed of the auspicious jambu fruit. He was eating the fruit, he swallowed the seed. And the local Stela Purana, the history of the story of this temple, which is late medieval, or even modern almost, records that story in this way. It says that because he had swallowed the seed sprouted, and the tree sprouted inside the ascetic's body and stuck its branches through the crown of his head. A remarkable, I think, expression, and here is the modern representation of it at the temple itself, a remarkable expression of yogic and cosmological imagery. Temples proliferate in a more elegant fashion, but I think with the same significance. And here I'm showing you two of the early 10th century temples that show the multiplying forms of the temple. Temples evolved to trace infinitely detailed illusions of reality, as in the ceilings of the mandapas themselves, and as monuments making meditation manifest. Angas, the divisions of the wall, are the piers of a temple's walls, the name of the piers of the temple's walls. But angas are also the practitioners or the limbs of yoga, the buttresses, but not the all of it. Thank you.